Hello? Hello? It's on. Okay, good. All right, good evening. We have a few stragglers coming in from outdoors, just getting a little bit more to eat and drink on the way in. My name is Jim Straub. I'm the president of the Architects Association for 2011. And I'd just like to welcome you to the second event of a four-part series we're presenting this year, along with Habitat for Humanity Santa Cruz County. We want to thank Barry Swenson tonight, Barry Swenson Builder, for sponsoring this event. Thank you very much. And that's right, it needs a little applause. And Marty McGraw for managing our publicity tonight. Thank you, Marty. Okay. Our group has been working hard this year. We restarted our open architecture tour, which took a year off last year, and was very successful this year, so we're very pleased with that. And we're also working with the County of Santa Cruz on a design charrette we're going to be doing this summer, where we're going to be looking to create a vision for the future development along SOQUEL Drive. We're going to be looking at the four nodes where the exits from Highway 1 hit SOQUEL Drive, so 41st, Bay Porter, Park Avenue, and State Park Drive. So if you're interested in any of that, we're inviting the public to come and take a look and be a part. So we'd like to see you. All right, tonight we have a little bit of a treat in the sense that we have a pre-speaker and then a speaker. The way we're doing this is we're having our introducing tonight's speaker and helping connect our first lecture on the Santa Cruz County's architectural past with this evening's subject, the Aptos Village Plan. Please welcome local historian Ross Gibson.
Thank you. In my introductory lecture, I attempted to show that the early pioneers often produced business districts as characterless warehouses for commerce or factories ravaging the landscape in the degradations of the Industrial Revolution, both of which in the end proved bad for business. When they realized that what tourism meant to the county and that the beauty of the landscape was in itself a commodity, then they attempted to match the beauty of the natural setting with artistic architecture. By the turn of the century, deliberate principles of city planning were becoming the science, and communities were crafting humanist environments, which is to say, environments designed around the pedestrian. These principles included creating pedestrian spaces and corridors, sculpting back tall buildings to allow solar access, incorporating greenery into urban spaces, adding public art, making dramatic architecture that was exciting to see, and landmarks that defined communities. Yet what seemed logical was soon threatened by a new aesthetic of minimalist industrialism, which brought with it an ethic that art and heritage have no practical uses in communities that should be designed around freeways and automobiles. That humanism is a spiritual concept in that art and beauty cater to the soul, but is merely an impractical waste of money to think that architecture should inspire rather than merely contain activity. And that early resistance to the monotony of modernism is irrelevant, as people will grow to like it if it's forced on them. But rather than directly oppose humanism, they turned it around to say that humanism is related to the Italian Renaissance, and therefore is not an ethic, but rather specific styles that follow neoclassical principles. And the styles, even when recently created in the previous decade, were historic, and history belongs to the past. This is why the majority of historic preservation movements originated after World War II, because they were trying to preserve humanism as it was being replaced by the freeway-centric city planning of communities designed around machines and not people. It is my personal philosophy that the cold architecture of blank canvases cannot compete with the embracing warmth of places that love people. So it was with great delight in the 1970s when I started to notice new buildings that complemented both the natural setting and historic neighborhoods. They understood the craftsman building ethic, and even when they were taking the styles in new directions. Among this new wave of architects were the studios of Thatcher and Thompson. A Minneapolis native, Matthew Thompson, got his Bachelor's of Architecture degree from the University of Minnesota in 1972, working with 3 Minneapolis architectural firms, including Miller, Melby, and Hanson, where Thomas Thatcher worked while attending college. The two came to Santa Cruz in 1973 to open their own architectural firm of Thatcher and Thompson. Matthew has been a good resource and friend in development issues that face our community, and I always look forward to seeing his ideas and hearing his thoughtful analysis. So it is my distinct pleasure to present our architect of the day, Matthew Thompson.
Thank you, Ross. And good evening. I want to give thanks again to Barry Swenson for sponsoring this. They also have sponsored most of the work that you're going to see tonight as the client, and so I guess there's some appropriateness there. I'm flattered by the nice turnout here, and I'm going to take you this evening first through kind of the evolution of the Aptos Village Plan. And then at the kind of the last third of it here, examine some ways in which, quite frankly, if we had a do-over button, things might have come together at least easier and quicker. The project in Aptos Village really needs a little bit of an introduction in terms of historic context. There are 19 historic buildings in Aptos Village, and the Aptos Village really was formed at the end of the 19th century as the railhead for logging operations in the mountains just above Aptos with a lumber mill, and Hinn, who was so busy developing the boardwalk in downtown Santa Cruz, was also the one who developed the mill and other buildings later in the village, including the little neighborhood that's still called the Hinn neighborhood, which is just east of where we were working. It meant that as we worked on Aptos Village, there were already buildings that had earned the affection of the community. It wasn't just a blank slate. We had some wonderful old buildings to play with. But this big white spot in the middle is the 8 acres that to this day remains essentially vacant. The striped building there off on the right here is the antique barn, the apple barn. But otherwise, it's essentially 8 acres of undeveloped land. Keep you, allow you to get oriented. This is the Bayview Hotel, SOQUEL Drive, Trout Gulch Road, the post office, Cathedral Drive, and like that. The Aptos Village planning process happened, got its first start in about 1979 when a plan was prepared called a design framework. Richard Peterson, who was a local architect, was the primary author for it, and this shows the land use plan for the village, and quite frankly, not much has happened in terms of changes to the land use plan, even in our current work. But the village plan, in fact, didn't allow anything to happen because there were 5 owners or 6 owners of the property, and nobody could ever find the wherewithal to combine them and make things happen. So in about 2002, there was a real feeling in the community that now it was time to finally do something with this 8 acres. And there was, in fact, a public-private initiative that really took off. The county was willing to get out in front and paid for, and commission had paid for a traffic study of Aptos Village. Also a market study by Kaiser Marston, a really good piece of work that established the need for commercial uses, residential uses, and the Public Works Department did an inventory of missing infrastructure, which has been one of the things that's always held up work in Aptos. But it was really a public-private effort because Barry Swenson stepped in after tying up a couple of the key pieces of that 8 acres and paid to prepare boundary and topo surveys, fund the public process and its facilitation, and hired us to do site analysis and urban design. The charrette, though, was really what got things kicked off. The county managed the process, hired MIG to, in fact, conduct the charrette. It was held on Saturday, June the 7th at the Valencia School, really well attended. There were over 60 people at the beginning and at least 50 people stuck around to the very end. The MIG methodology involves, whoops, wrong button, come back, involves creating a map to scale of the village and as a game board. And after spending about an hour brainstorming as a group, they divided up into 4 teams, and each team took one of these maps on a table. You can kind of see them up here. And they were given colored blocks to scale that represented exactly what the market study said could be supported by Aptos Village. So in fact, the teams of citizens were using the very tools that one would use to allocate space in the village. And it was a tremendously successful time. The 4 teams then each reported out their design at the very end, and there was a lot of similarity between the 4, a real consensus already. And here are the outcomes. Here's what people in the end said about their vision for Aptos Village, that it should have neighborhood-serving commercial spaces. They wanted stores that would actually be useful to them in their lives. It had to have adequate parking, and part of this reflected the fact that the village is presently chronically short of parking. They wanted it to be pedestrian-friendly with tree-lined streets. They described a small-town character. I do a fair number of charrettes. This was the first time I heard a community say in a charrette that they wanted the businesses to be successful as a particular point that they wanted to make. They wanted a strong visual identity. The village green, and MIG gave them green paper so that they could cut it out. The village green was spontaneously part of all 4 designs. And all of the teams figured out that the only way to get all of the things to fit in the village was to put some of the housing on top of commercial spaces, and sometimes even to create a 3rd story. All 4 teams ended up coming to the same conclusion independently. So after the charrette, we stepped in to start doing some initial design work. 2 of the teams had suggested that the new street connect with Trout Gulch and head up this way into the mountains. This is what we think of as Trout Gulch today, and it turns here at the post office, but the new street would connect to it there. The other 2 teams said, no, the new street should connect down to Valencia. So with a difference of opinion about this, we started to look at the 2 and realized that there were, in fact, things to be said for both. So before we had our first follow-up meeting with the public, we examined both options and did a kind of pro and con analysis that we could share with the public so that when we first got the public together, we could have them weigh in. And sure enough, when we did that, later in the fall, it's the Valencia option that, in fact, was the overwhelming consensus choice. So this first public meeting in the fall of 2003 was at the Aptos Park community building. It was so well attended that people didn't even fit in. They had to stand outside and look in through the windows. And We described what the charrette process had done. We described what we had learned in our initial site planning. And it was a really good meeting on a number of different levels. There were people who definitely came with concerns. I would say a good third of the people came mad as hell about something. And so at the end of the meeting, we identified 4 issues, and we put clipboards at the back of the room so that people could sign up for which issue was their issue. And we surprisingly had exactly 12 people sign up on the clipboard for each of these issues, and we followed these up with evening meetings that were obviously of small size, a dozen people. And we took on first parking and traffic, but with Jack Sarayakov, the county traffic engineer there. And we started out with 12 angry people convinced that traffic and parking were going to be always a mess. And at the end of an hour and a half, they had come to understand what the traffic study said. And believe it or not, Jack Sarayakov can be very persuasive when there's just 12 people around the table, because every time they came up with some cockamamie idea that wasn't going to work or missed the facts, he wasn't at all bashful to let them know it. We also worked with the village committee on the village green and the sidewalk design, and for this I used a series of poster-sized photographs that I took from secret cities to show them different sizes of sidewalks and street design. And the interesting part there was that they always chose the smallest one, the smallest scale sidewalk or street. Over the next year, as we developed the initial specific plan for the area, we had a lot of opportunities to meet with the public. And one of the things that we found was that people were constantly misunderstanding the scale of the village and the nature of the problems that we faced. So I started using these comparisons here. Whoops, didn't mean to do that quite this fast. On the left here is Rancho Del Mar Shopping Center at the same scale as Aptos Village. In a traditional suburban shopping center, here are the sidewalks. Here are the sidewalks in Aptos Village, and they're not just that there's more sidewalks on the right, it's that they're a completely different pattern. They form a network as opposed to these kind of long strings of things. But we also wanted people to be able to appreciate that development doesn't mean less green. In the case of tree cover, for instance, a built-out village would add to the tree cover. We had a hard time convincing people that we were really taking them seriously about parking until I created this poster, which allowed them to compare the amount of parking that we were proposing compared to what was in the village today. And then the more frequent comment is, do we really need all that parking? And then sidewalks. Again, we hear frequently as architects and planners, people wanted things to be pedestrian friendly, but oftentimes they don't actually take the idea of pedestrian friendly to the next step, which is, well, what does that mean? Well, that means that you have sidewalks that are well designed in the right places. And so, again, these are the sidewalks in the village today. Here are the sidewalks when we're done. It's not just that there are a few more sidewalks, there really are sidewalks that connect up the village. By the end of 18 months, we had reached a point where we could actually do an illustration like this that started to suggest the character of the village. And we then started working on the specific plan. The notion of the specific plan was that unlike a typical project that goes through the zoning process, in a specific plan you really you set the zoning ordinances aside, you design the project, and then you kind of figure out, well, what would be the appropriate rules if you were to do this project. So it's all design-based. You don't ever ask yourself what the zoning ordinance says. You say, what is a good design? So as we set out to design the neighborhood spaces, pardon me, I keep hitting the wrong button here. The things that we took on were, first of all, street design. We had 2 major new streets to go in. How are we going to build them? I keep doing this. The Village Green, which was really important to everybody in the community who had anything to say about it. Build 2 lines, which is about how to place a building against the sidewalk, that you don't set things back. And then building edges. One of the things that we discovered when we did our photographic survey of Aptos Village is how many of the historic buildings extend out over the sidewalk, either with a porch roof or a balcony. It's in fact, the majority of the buildings in the village have a feature of a covered sidewalk or covered walkway of some sort. As a matter of fact, I love the fact that on the south side of SOQUEL Drive, they still have some boardwalk sidewalks. So we'll see how long that lasts. And then what we had to do was take the 65 units of housing and the roughly 60,000 square feet of new commercial space and figure out how to use it in the 8 acres by allocating it to building sites and then allocating building program to each of those building sites and then testing each of those building sites to make sure that we had enough parking. So essentially writing the program for the architectural phase. And then we had to identify the building typologies. Historic buildings is an easy one, but we knew from the charrette that we were going to have multi-story commercial buildings and mixed-use buildings with residential over commercial. And we also knew that on the north end of the village, where we back up to the residential neighborhood, that we were going to have some townhouses. This is along Granite Way, and then also some hillside townhouses, which we'll see here in a while. And then we had to actually compose a design for the village, and I think this is one of the places where how we approach this varied so much from conventional zoning. Because we had a blank slate, and because we could essentially use design strategies instead of zoning strategies, we started out with a hierarchy of buildings. There are some buildings that are just flat out more important than others. And building 4, which you'll see here in a little bit, is the building that's terminates the view from SOQUEL Drive up to the green. It's the, if you will, the most important new building in the village because it's in fact how you can tell you've arrived when you reach the village. Imageability is something that I feel really strongly about. This is the notion that as we walk around in communities, we tell where we are by the image that we keep in our mind's eye. So it's really important for us to have landmarks. That's in fact how we keep from being lost. And so if you in fact create a neighborhood where you can always orient yourself because there's always a building that you recognize, you're more comfortable, you are more relaxed. So we worked really hard, to keep imageability, and we'll see this in a little while. And of course, massing, and then parking lot layout. In our experience with doing urban design for this kind of context, how to deal with the automobile is unfortunately almost the very first thing you have to deal with because it overwhelms the landscape. The automobiles are just so big. And that results in what we call the regulating plan, and it looks like a parcel map because in fact what we did very consciously was to divide up the 8 acres that we were playing with into parcels, and we'll come back to that later. Each of the parcels is numbered, and as you go through in the specific plan, then there are rules and expectations for each numbered lot. And then we had to create a form code, and this is essentially what replaces zoning. If you have a specific plan and there's no zoning attached, you have to come up with a set of rules that essentially provide a framework for architects to come in and then design individual buildings. And so you can see, for instance, up here, we specifically made it clear that you're allowed to put roof canopies over the sidewalk, that you're allowed to have balconies and porches above the sidewalk. that you can create these kinds of arcades. We include sign rules that are somewhat different than the conventional rules. We deal with the nature of planting along sidewalks and building edges. We deal with roof shapes and building composition. And this starts to look a lot like a zoning ordinance. The difference is that it's all design-based and, in fact, much simpler to use than a conventional zoning ordinance. And then lastly, as we worked with the public, we had to, from time to time, even though we hadn't designed any buildings yet, we had to communicate with them, so what is the scale going to be like? This is the village green and the dimension across and the building height, so we could start to get folks to dial in their mind's eye what this might be like. So at this point, we were essentially done with a draft specific plan. And the next step really was to take what we had come up with and to test the market analysis, have independent market folks come in, real estate brokers, commercial real estate brokers, and the like, look at our design and say, okay, is this going to add up? Is there going to be a market for this? Is there going to be an ability to get enough rents to cover the cost of construction, which of course meant that we had to estimate project cost, and of course Barry Swenson's team did that. We also had to work with the county staff to identify exceptions to zoning. Now we didn't really in the real world need to do this, but they thought we needed to. And then we had to plan implementation strategies. It's important to remember now that this is still made up of separate parcels, and it's surrounded by more parcels. There's probably a dozen landowners that are in one way or another affected by the project. And there was a railroad crossing, and there was confused ownership of the road that leads into the state park. We had to get a bill passed by the state legislature to clean up the title problems with the road that leads into the park. And hats off to the county, they got that done. But at a certain point, and not at a certain point, at a very specific point in early 2005, we had a new planning director who had been working with us for a couple of months. I don't know where the decision came from, but there was a fairly abrupt decision that we weren't going to do a specific plan after all. The county had never done one before. There was a sense that it would be too complicated and make things more difficult to get approved. And we weren't in any position to argue about things like that. And what the planning director wanted to do was instead a more conventional approach using an area plan update, taking that 1976 plan that we saw a little bit ago and update it, and then develop the project by using a planned unit development, which allows us to vary from the zoning ordinance for a specific project. But this had real consequences, and one of the first ones, and for the architects in the audience, they'll understand this. In a plan development, you have to design all the buildings at the beginning. With a specific plan, you do the plan and then you have architects come in after the plan's been adopted and they design buildings. So it was a disappointment to be told that now we had to design the 18 buildings that were going to be making up the village, when we had really hoped that, in fact, this could be done at a later date with a lot of architects. So to get over this notion that we are now just one architectural firm doing this, we took 3 people in our firm and teamed with 2 architects in the architectural firm that's part of Barry Swenson. And between the 5 of us designed the 18 buildings so that we could try and keep some variety in it. But it was still a disappointment that we were going to have to go through the plan development process. But the first step, in fact, was to do the area plan update. So we agreed to provide the graphics for the area plan update. As published, the area plan update is in black and white, so you get to see the color ones. But they included the kind of typical things that planning documents have, and again, this one looks remarkably like that 1976 area plan drawing you saw. Things really haven't changed that much at the scale of planner works. Physical form, this one though is a little different. You can see the new road that we're proposing through here, the east-west road that connects with Valencia over here, and the new north-south road, which I've always called Parade because that's what you call streets that end in a park. And you can kind of see in this here where they're trying to suggest taller buildings here and the green in the middle. Again, this didn't tell us anything that we didn't already know because we had done this plan 2 years earlier. And then, of course, land use, and this looks like just the others except it has different colors. But at a certain point, we ended up having to actually do a plan for the village that now shows all the buildings laid out. This is the site plan for the plan unit development. And although this was never shown as part of the development of the area plan, of course it existed. This was kind of the area plan reverse engineered, where you design all the buildings first and then you do the abstract plan to justify it. But I'm going to take you now quickly through the architecture because I kind of figure this audience might want to see that part of it. This is a view from SOQUEL Avenue, and the viewer would have the Sparrow Cafe to your back, and you're looking north at the building at the end of the street here is building 4, and the green is in the foreground there, but of course it's so flat here you can't see that. Bayview Hotel would be off to the right? Yes, Bayview Hotel is right over here. Yeah, thanks. And then for the village green, it would be kind of fun to just look at this for a bit. This is JONI JANECKI's actual landscape plan, current landscape plan for the village green. When I worked with the members of the community programming the village green, we talked about scaling things so that at just a usual lunchtime, if there were 30 people having a sandwich outside at a table around here, it would look activated. You know, kind of picture Gale's or Kelly's Bakery on the west side of Santa Cruz. You get 30 people hanging around having sandwiches. It looks like it's a happening place. But they also wanted to be able to do performances, you know, up here with people sitting on the lawn down here. For 100, maybe even 200 people, the Aptos Jazz Band comes to perform, and there's actually a place for the audience to see it. And then, of course, if you block off the streets here and you take this whole area, you could actually have 1,000 people for a Flag Day event or something of that sort. And then there is the community tree. So. Building 4 is the only one of 2 all commercial buildings. It's a 3-story building, probably retail down below, offices. This loggia portion in the middle recesses back in. This, I've always thought, because it'll have an ocean view, would make a nice place for a dinner restaurant. But in any case, this building 4 connects on the left to building 3, and we'll come back to that, and to the old apple barn on the right, and we'll see that in a bit. But I thought to just help you stay oriented, we'd start by just kind of going around the village green now that we're up here. Next to it is the apple barn. The apple barn is kind of the diamond in the rough for the village because it doesn't look like much today, especially on the inside. It's really a neat historic building, and we're going to pick it up and move it and reestablish it probably as the anchor store, probably a community grocery store, because it is by far the largest building in the village now and will always be the largest building in the village. It's about 12,000 square feet, and connecting to the building 4 will have about 18,000 square feet on one floor. And then the other direction is Building 3. Building 3 is commercial on the ground floor, and then 2 floors of apartments above. This is the only building where all of the residential units are flats, so particularly attractive for people who need to live without steps. A tough thing to do in Aptos. It's a hilly spot. And then coming around, going across the street, so kind of kitty corner from the park, is the smallest building, Building 7, which has 3 apartments up above and a commercial space down below. Valencia Street is in front and Parade is coming up the side. And then the last building on the green is Building 8 over here. This is right at the corner with the Oreo window. But Building 8 actually connects to Building 9, and Building 9 then also connects to Building 10. And they connect at the 2nd floor because we have an elevator over in this corner that allows us to then have housing on the 2nd floor that's all accessible. You can see that some of the units are in fact 2-story units, and some of them are 1-story units over here. Building 10 is one of our kind of sad stories because it was a really sweet building with a flat roof, and the Board of Supervisors, when they adopted the area plan in their infinite wisdom, decided to outlaw flat roofs in Aptos Village, so we had to change it, and I'm disappointed. Building 2 is just west of Building 3, and it is a series of 11 townhouses that then, oops, pardon me, I keep hitting the wrong button, that sit over commercial spaces. And the commercial spaces can be 550 to 1,100 square feet. And the notion was that some of the stall antique dealers in the antique barn might even be able to relocate here. On the 2nd floor, you can see our, as I say, a series of 11 townhouses. Building 6 is my favorite, one that I did. This is at the corner of Valencia and Trout Gulch, and so it's kind of another entry building. It's it'll have a very strong presence on that corner. You can kind of see it's fairly tall, and this is Valencia coming down, and Trout Gulch is coming down on its way to SOQUEL Drive. Again, introducing this notion of a 2nd floor loggia, an outdoor deck that extends out to the east. This is also a 100% commercial building on both the 1st and the 2nd floor. And then moving up the hill behind Building 6 are townhouses. This is along Granite Way, and there are a total of, how many townhouses? 11 townhouses on this one too, as I'm pretty sure. I'm not going to stop and count them. And these essentially create a transition area between the existing single-family north that is on the other side of Granite Way and kind of up Cathedral Drive, and the mixed-use village down below. It was interesting at the charrette, all 4 teams figured out how to do this without any prompting. That is to say, to use a cluster of multifamily housing as a way to transition from the existing neighborhood to the new village. I actually find that at the charrettes, the general public seems to be every bit as good at picking up planning concepts as our local staff. And then finally, Building 11 is literally on a hillside. You can see how intense the hillside is over here, and it is 6 townhouses that step up the hill with garages cut in as basements. And a shot here of the village green, and of course you're seeing Building 4, the old apple barn, antique barn relocated, and Building 3, the apartments with the village green in the foreground there. Building 7 would be right next to us here. And so...
Go through the numbers real quickly, Matthew. Show us what 4 and 6 and 9 are.
Okay, yeah, let me do that. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Back one. Here's the green. So looking up Parade, here's building 4, building 3, the antique barn picked up and rotated and plopped down over here. Here's building 6. Here are those townhouses that kind of separate the village from the existing single family up here. Here are those hillside townhouses. Yep. Yep.
What's going to happen at the intersections between Trout Gulch and Parade and Aptos Creek with all the additional traffic?
Okay, that's a good question. Part of the reason that Jack Sarayakoff was so cocky in answering the neighbors' concerns about traffic is that there really had already been a lot of traffic work done, not just the recent one, but earlier studies. And they all indicated that by signalizing Trout Gulch at SOQUEL Drive, pretty much all the problems are solved. Now, that isn't to say that they don't want to also ultimately signalize this intersection as well. So the automobile traffic portion of it actually is fairly small because you've got to remember this is still a really small area. Another way of thinking about it, all of the commercial area, all the new commercial square footage that we're putting in the village would fit inside the Best Buy store on 41st Avenue. So, yeah. So this is not a very big area here, folks, and so the traffic consequences were never particularly big. The bigger consequences, of course, were the fact that Trout Gulch carries a lot of traffic from Upper Aptos that gets trapped down at this intersection, and that's where the signalization is necessary.
Parade Avenue, one-way or two-way?
Two-way. Yeah, the streets are two-way, and maybe just a slight comment about that. The street geometries, the dimensions and everything are very carefully worked out and are based on really well-established patterns. After we had done this, and it was as final as this drawing as you can see here, I found myself in Bar Harbor, Maine to visit my brother, and Bar Harbor is a beautiful place, a tourist destination, a lovely little village. So I got out my tape measure, because I always have my tape measure, and measured the streets and sidewalks, and it's exactly what we have here. The distance between buildings is exactly the same. The distance between curbs is the same. It's really a conventional village street and streetscape. Now let me, I wish I could put down the microphone, but let me take a break here, because where I'm going to transition to now is kind of, so if we had a community consensus and we had a plan all worked out in 2005, the specific plan draft written, well supported by the community, how did we get to 2011? And I think that's a fair question, because not a whole lot happened in that intervening period of time. We certainly had a chance to talk about things more than once, but in fact, not much happened. It was really a classic case of a design-based project being plugged into a zoning system, and quite frankly, zoning just doesn't work very well. It doesn't work very well in most cases, except in perhaps suburbia. So I thought it would be useful tonight to ask the question, and I'm hoping to answer the question, how could it have been different? What would have happened if we had used our time more wisely over the last 6 years? And in fact, the village was now largely built because we had, in fact, gotten the entitlements in 2006, and architects had worked through 2007 and then built it in 2008. That's not crazy. Certainly, Frederick Hinn would have thought that that was a pretty appropriate way to go about it when he was building the village the first time. So, as it turns out, in my professional practice, I've come across some techniques that I think are worth considering. When we get frustrated with the planning process, we're inclined oftentimes to say, well, you know, it's that planning staff. If it weren't for the planning staff, this would just fly right through. Or, you know, it's the Board of Supervisors, it's the Planning Commission, or it's that zoning ordinance. God, it's that, if we had a better zoning ordinance, things would be better. Or maybe if we didn't have CEQA and all these attorneys just making things miserable for us, we'd have an easier time of it. But I work in enough different communities, so I'm convinced that while all of those players probably have something to do with things not working as well as we'd like, in fact, it could be the answer, or you wouldn't be able to see the very same thing happening in community after community. And I'm convinced that the real problem is that zoning is the wrong tool for what we're trying to accomplish here. And that isn't because we've got the wrong people using it. It isn't because we've got the wrong politicians in office. No, it's just zoning's the wrong tool. So what is the right tool? Well, for a long time, I had a hard time even allowing myself to daydream about that because I couldn't imagine how any new tool would replace zoning. I mean, there are 30,000 professional planners in the country using zoning. How are we going to convince these 30,000 people to go back to school and do things differently? That didn't seem like an even interesting question. So for a long time, I just kind of figured, well, we'll just make do the best we can, and we would do planned unit developments and the like. But about 10 years ago, I was introduced to a new way of looking at things that, in fact, has gained a lot of support in the planning community. But it does require you to actually think completely differently. It says, forget about zoning, forget about land use. And that's a tough one because planning kind of starts with land use in most people's minds. No, we replace it with something called the TRANSECT. And it's just an idea actually stolen from biologists. The natural TRANSECT is something that if you've taken Ecology 101, you probably come across at some point. The natural TRANSECT is just an intellectual device that biologists use to help understand the transition that you see across the landscape from the water to the beach and dunes to the different plant communities that along our coast go up to oak woodland and grassland to riparian areas to foothills and on up the mountains. What is important about this is that in the, excuse me, one more time, in the natural TRANSECT, there really is a gradient that goes, if you will, uphill from the coast, from wet to dry and from low to high. But that we also know that there's actually an order within each one of these different places along the TRANSECT. If you picture a riparian area, within that riparian area, you can understand the order of the plant and animal life that's within that part of it, and then they're all connected. But the TRANSECT is also an empirical tool. When a biologist goes out in the field, gosh darn it, they'll cordon off an area and count all the plants within a sample section. There's a lot of counting and measuring involved here, and keeping track of a normative baseline. A biologist wants to know, okay, so what is the average rainfall in this spot? Or what is the average days of sun in this spot? What is the baseline for this, ecological niche? And then also, what is the function and value? What are the functions of these particular trees or these particular bushes? And in this case, what kind of value do they add to the area? Now, the biologists got this figured out, and then a smarty-pants architect said, you know, there's an analogy I can picture. How about a rural-urban TRANSECT instead of a natural TRANSECT from wet to dry and low to high? So in the rural-urban TRANSECT, we identify 6 transects. The first one is called rural preserve, and that really is wilderness. And what we mean by rural preserve is that we're setting this land aside, and pretty much in the rural reserve, humans are best if they're not seen or their effects seen. We like to think that these are self-regulating habitats. T2 is the rural reserve, and that's really, that's farmland and parks. It's the working landscape. It's landscape that we have taken over as humans and put to use. T3 is the suburban zone, and this is most of Santa Cruz, is the suburban zone, or suburban transect. And in T3, there are some key markers, if you will. In T3, the automobile is how you get around. You might walk a little bit for recreation, but basically the way you get from one place to another is the automobile. A shopping center in, a really big shopping center in T3, you might be tempted to drive your car from one side of the parking lot to the other side of the parking lot rather than walk. And as I said, most of Santa Cruz is T3, but T4, general urban, is Aptos Village, and in fact is if you kind of picture Aptos Village in its context, it's an island of general urban surrounded by suburban. T5 is the urban center, and that's easiest. Just picture downtown Santa Cruz along Pacific Avenue. And you have to go to San Francisco to get to T6, so we won't spend much time talking about it. So let's go back to the suburban transect 3, and here again, remember the automobile is the way you get around, but also think of how buildings are placed in the third transect. They're usually in a landscape setting. As a matter of fact, in the beginning of our suburban development in this country, in the beginning of the 20th century, park-like setting was the way you described a really good suburban community. But it meant that buildings are always seen with landscape in the foreground. So you're composing your building as an element in a landscape with always a landscape foreground. General urban is different in the sense that now a very important method of getting around is walking, because T4 is designed for walking. So it has to be more compact, and it has to have sidewalks. So the general urban transect is the one where the pedestrian has at least parity with the automobile. And then the urban center, and we won't spend much time talking about it today because it's not part of Aptos Village, but imagine the urban center now is a place where you probably are more efficient walking than driving. As a matter of fact, you may not be able to park your car on the same building that you work in, on the same piece of land that you work in. Parking becomes shared, and transit becomes important. Which brings us to the centerpiece, which is neighborhoods. Neighborhood health, in Europe they call it urban health, but it's the same thing. Jane Jacobs laid out the basic parameters for this in the early 60s. A mix of uses. A true neighborhood is not just one thing. It's not just housing or just commercial. It's a mix of uses. There's connectivity. That is to say, it's real easy to get from one place to another, not just by one path, but by multiple paths. Jane Jacobs described this as small blocks. Appropriateness, the right stuff at the right size. There's a kind of grain to the fourth transect that's important. You rarely see anything that's just way too big for it, if it's a healthy one. And compactness, and this brings us back to walking. The quarter-mile radius is pretty well regarded as that radius that people will readily walk for errands and kind of general life. So it means that in a healthy neighborhood, what we really want to do is put as many things as you need in your daily life within a quarter-mile, 5-minute walk. And that has been our goal with Aptos Village. Now, it turns out that TRANSECT 4 is also real timely because we're concerned about sustainability. And in fact, TRANSECT 4 is extremely important for sustainability because A, it's walking based. It's the first TRANSECT where you can live without a car. It's compact, which means we're using our land resources well. And it's diverse because it's mixed use. The diversity is actually important on a number of reasons. Biologists will talk about how a habitat that has a broad range of species is more robust and more stable long-term than a monoculture where there's only one species. Oh no. The other thing, though, that I noticed about TRANSECT 4 stuff before I knew about TRANSECTs. For about 40 years I've been fascinated by the fact that there was a real common thread between all the places that I visited and saw that stole my heart. They had these common elements, and for a long time I couldn't figure out what that thread was. I would always measure their sidewalks and whatnot, but I couldn't quite figure out what it was. And it turns out that, well, they're pretty much always TRANSECT 4 places. And so I started to ask myself, so what is it about places that win our affection? And the picture on the screen here is Port Merion. I don't know if any of you recognize it. It's in Wales, and it's a pleasure park, the sole purpose of which is to delight your senses visually and otherwise. And it's a wonderful architectural folly. If you find yourself in Wales, it's worth the trip. And I mention it because you walk into Port Merion and it steals your heart in a second. You kind of go, oh! But it turns out, as I'm listing here, that in fact these places that steal your heart are not just the matters of romance. You can figure them out by measuring them and by comparing them. And with Google Earth, you can compare them without even getting up from your desk. And it's really true that since Jane Jacobs, we've been really keen on this notion of evidence, that you understand places, in fact, by studying them, not in an abstract way, but in a real measure it kind of way. And if you do that, you can start to actually identify best practices that will deliver the goods. For TRANSECT 4, there are now books you can buy that show you essentially how to get there. So how would it work here in Santa Cruz? Well, it turns out that we've already done this once before with the downtown recovery plan after the Loma Prieta earthquake in '89. We didn't know it at the time, but the urban designer who worked with the city, Roma up in San Francisco, brought these understandings to the table. And so our downtown recovery plan had the features that I think we need to have. And we've used it. We know it works. We know it has predictable results. So what we had with the downtown recovery plan was essentially a specific plan. Here's a key thing. As soon as the downtown recovery plan was done, they did SEQUEL on it, so that everything that came after already had its environmental review. This is really a crucial thing because it means that after the specific plan is adopted and the SEQUEL review is done, your project's entitled, which means that with a form-based code, your buildings are entitled before you design them. And as somebody who's had the opportunity to work this way, I can tell you it's a different ballgame when you sit down to your desk and you know how big the building can be, you know where it needs to be located, you know how tall it can be, you know what it can have, and you are designing for a design outcome instead of a planning approval. And it allows a much more efficient design process when you know your project's already approved before you start designing. And then this last one Design review by peer was one that in the downtown recovery plan we also had, and when my partner Tom and I first encountered this, we weren't so sure about this one. That is that there was a consultant who was going to review your plans. Another architect was going to come in and give you the whatever about your plan. And of course, no sooner had we actually gone through this once that we realized, hey, this is pretty good. This is a colleague. I can talk to this person. We speak the same language. And not only that, he doesn't have a hammer holding over my head. He's just giving me his best advice. I can take it or leave it. My project's already entitled. It makes for a really good conversation, and I don't think there's any question but that University Town Center benefited from the interaction that we had with the folks at Roma. Now, with Aptos Village, we've already done the hard part. We already have consensus on a plan, the part that is usually the tough part. And so we already know how to do that part, I think, pretty darn well. The actual mechanics of adopting a specific plan aren't as mysterious as they're sometimes made out to be. What we need is the implementing tool of a form-based code. And what I've put on the screen here is something called a page out of what's called the SMART code, because if you're a community like Santa Cruz that's new, it turns out you don't actually have to write the form-based code. Somebody's already done it for you, and you don't even have to buy it. It's free. The form-based code part we already have available to us. All we have to do is start using it. So why is it worth going through all of this? Well, first of all, it lets neighborhoods evolve in a way that actually reflects the community, because remember, we had the community completely on board by the second public meeting. We had consensus, and the disappointing part is that what I hear when I run into people in the community now is, whatever happened to that plan? We really liked it, but we haven't heard anything in ages. Because the architect sits down to design a building that's already entitled, it's a lot faster and a lot cheaper because you only design it for your client, and you don't have the planning review process. Here's an important one: enhance opportunities for adjacent property owners to create mutual projects. There is currently no way for two property owners who have property right next to each other to do a successful project in the county of Santa Cruz as a mutual project. We've tried. None of them have ever been built because zoning just hates this kind of stuff. But in fact, specific plans, because they're using a form-based code and this regulating plan, it makes it very easy for two adjacent property owners to cooperate. Improved neighborhood health and self-esteem. I'm big on neighborhood health these days. I am absolutely convinced that that healthy neighborhoods are really appreciated by the people who live in them, and it's what makes people proud of their neighborhood. You know, we've heard the old song from realtors for years, location, location, location. Well, if you stop to think about it, what they're really saying is neighborhood, neighborhood, neighborhood. And if you want to make a smart investment, invest in making your neighborhood healthier, because you're in there for the long run. Wider opportunity for small local investors. Some of you may remember Terrace Point from a million years ago. Jim Pepper, from the former professor at UCSC Environmental Planning, and I worked together on that for years. And one of the things that we were fascinated with was the fact that everybody wanted to make the buildings bigger, and we kept trying to figure out how to make the buildings smaller, because in fact there is real value in small buildings. So how do you get small buildings? Well, it's really hard once you have a big lot to break it up into smaller lots, quite frankly, almost everywhere. But it didn't always used to be this way. When, and Jim and I discovered this by looking at old maps, it used to be that you would plat a whole block into 25-foot wide lots, and it didn't mean that you built 25-foot wide buildings. If you wanted to build a 75-foot wide building, you bought 3 lots. Well, that's a really good way to think about things, because if you start out with small lots, it means that if you want to build a small building, you actually can, and you don't have to become a developer to do it. And if you build a small building, you hire your own architect, you hire your own builder, you have your own mortgage. And so what it comes down to is that in Aptos Village, what we really were trying to do is create an opportunity so that somebody could buy a piece of ground, hire their architect, design the building, build the building, maybe even live and work in the building. Red Tree Properties project on the far west side on Delaware is a modern day attempt to get back at that. One of the most disappointing things about having to do the PUD, quite frankly, was being the only architect, because we had to really work hard to keep the variety that would have come naturally if 18 buildings had been designed by a dozen architects. Lastly, for some of you, this isn't new. You know about communities like Seaside, Florida, where these techniques have been used. And we do hear from time to time concern that, oh, yeah, I've heard about this form-based code stuff, but it's just going to give us a pastiche of old stuff, and we're not interested in that. We're in the 21st century. But in fact, that really is a bum rap, because there certainly have been a lot of new urbanist form-based code projects that have used traditional building vocabularies, in part because this is caught on in parts of the country where that's really appreciated, and in part because almost all of this is being done by developers who ultimately need to sell it to the public, and they try and meet public taste. But one of my favorites, this is called Beer Line in Milwaukee, and if you find yourself in Milwaukee, it's worth looking into. It's huge. It's along a river that used to be breweries and rail lines, and it's a huge, very dense Transect 4 neighborhood, very successful. And the architecture's like this, very contemporary, wonderful pedestrian neighborhood. This is Seaside, kind of the one of the first to get built at an appropriate scale. But even in our firm, you know, we did this in Aptos Village, but then for the same developer, did this on the west side. I consider the specific plan form-based code thing, TRANSECT-based, to be really style neutral. That's kind of what the architects bring to it. And there are some form-based codes that write style rules into it. We have been both the creators of specific plans and the architects using specific plans. And so we did buildings in Hercules for a specific plan done by another firm, and that did have style requirements. And they were pretty ridiculous. So I certainly don't suggest them as being the way to go about this. So this is the last slide. If you're interested in this, Congress on New Urbanism is a large organization. The Center for Applied Transect Studies are actually the folks who are working on developing form-based codes that use the Transect as the way of understanding things. So how do you do this without throwing zoning out? Well, the good news is that you don't have to do the whole city at one time. Although you can, Miami, Florida, did a Transect-based code for the entire city of Miami. So some people really go for the gusto. But here in California, Petaluma took their downtown area and made a specific plan just for the downtown area. I think that it's entirely appropriate to do specific plans and form-based codes for things as small as 3 acres, because even a 3-acre project can have a huge impact on a neighborhood. So the real test is this going to make the neighborhood more healthy? Is this project of the size that it could actually affect neighborhood health? Well, if that's the case, then there's certainly a good reason to not approach it one building at a time, but use a form-based code and a specific plan.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate it.